As Tony helpfully said, we're on lecture 8, and this is about chapter 21 of volume 2 of Capital. Actually, it's going to be in 3 parts today. I've got some points about what we've been looking at in already in terms of chapter 20, and then the main point we'll be looking at chapter 21. But because this is the last lecture covering the book itself, I did want to just take some time to take a slight step back and reflect my reflections anyway on what we've learnt. And also there is a pedagogical note which has come up in the reading groups very much. There are different ways of explaining the concept. I mean, Marx very much uses examples as well as his text, but also for this schema in particular, that there are useful algebraic expressions of the relations. And also, as you know, I tend to use diagrams in these PowerPoints, and they're all perfectly valid. But I also think that in terms of active sort of learning, as well as the studying and discussion, if you can go some way to working through the examples, that does consolidate one's understanding of what's going on. And I'm sorry about the length of the lecture, but kind of like needs must. But if you're watching this as a recording, there'll be 2 breakpoints, so in the 3 parts. One of the issues that came up is how do Marx's concepts correspond to the sort of actual categories used by capitalism itself? This comes from a textbook for finance managers, and you may see a certain similarity to the circuits of capital in this diagram. So in bourgeois accounting, this is working capital. This is the whole asset base less the liabilities. So, but not fixed assets. So they call them current assets. So it's quite close to the idea of circulating capital. And there is this notion, if you can see the small arrows on the screen, you can see that there is this sort of circular movement. So that confirms well the whole question of flow, and the different sort of stations in this do conform quite closely to the capital forms of Marx. Okay, so what we've got here basically is an inventory flow model of circulating constant capital. And there's 2 inventories, where there's the commodities that have been bought and the commodities that are ready to be sold. So that again conforms to Marx's view. And this is capital in, not capital in, well, there's a distinction between the circuit of commodity capital and capital in circulation, which is also Smith's sort of confusion of that carries forward in the way accounting to this day sees these things, right? There is a missing link. What a surprise. I put a big question mark there, which is how does the inventory of finished goods have more value than the inventory of the raw materials and components? And of course, this way of looking at it doesn't take that into account, really. The workers aren't present even because they're not considered an asset, let alone a value creating asset, right? There is a sort of conceptual confusion at points when used for an exchange value. So there is a partial recognition here of what we've looked at in terms of the circuits of capital, without a doubt. But not surprisingly, we could say it's from a class perspective. But you could follow it up and have a look. This one is not of an industrial capital; it's of a commercial capital. It's another sort of textbook type study. And what you see here is the idea of the importance of circulation. I mean, commercial capital is all about buying and selling, as we know. So the inventory, they're not 2 inventories. There's only 1 inventory because it's the same stuff. There's no production phase to this cycle. So the inventory for the bought goods is the same as what's going to be sold. There's no sort of labor processing between the 2, except putting them on the shelf and taking them off the shelf, right? And so the inventory turnover is important to this type of capital, how quickly the goods move. And what you can see from this example is that they will move more slowly, actually, in 2012 than they did in 2009. But about once every 2 months, the goods that come in go out the door. There's another turnover period, which is highlighted in terms of how quickly the money comes back. I mean, there's a difference between the goods being sold and the money received for those sales. And you see that is many more of those turnovers a year. And so what you've got here is an idea of circulating capital. If you added those 2 together, you would actually get the period of the circulation period, right? And it turns out to be about 10 or 12 weeks. So this is close to Marx's conceptualization. And of course, what they're interested in is how, improving or not, I mean, the business actually got worse by some measures between these 2 years because of the decline in trading conditions, basically. But what you can see is this is being compared to the industry average. And of course, what you've got is this particular company is doing better than the industry average. This is quite important, actually, because the way profitability is normally demonstrated is against competitors in the same industry, and that's the return on equity measure of profitability. I mean, this company's doing better, but you can see they're not widely different. I mean, so you're not going to have a huge, unless there's a sort of revolutionary breakthrough in the way things are done, or if like a paradigm breakthrough in the technical way of producing things or turning things over, they're going to be similar numbers for turnover, some better, some worse. The other thing that we looked at was this question of capital and revenue. This was very interesting discussion, actually, and I think it's worth going back to. I mean, Adam Smith is quoted by Hodgson. I don't think this quote is in actually Marx, but this, sort of the influence of Smith is there because Marx writes about apologetic economists. But he's basically critiquing the idea that labour power is a form of capital, which is what Smith says in Wealth of Nations. So it's wrong to say that money realizes two capitals, right? And he makes a very definite position here. I mean, this is clearly a class line, right? Which is labour power is not capital; it's the capacity to renew the workers, right? And it's sort of very emphasized, right? And it's only capital in the hands of the buyer, the capitalist, right? I mean, if it were true, then slaves would be capitalists, which is quite ridiculous, right? I mean, this is not a technical point, really. This is primarily an ideological point, right? Which is the market connection is still a class relation, and the two class parties are connected as buyers and sellers, but they have very different positioning in that market relation. And this thing about human capital, Stephen gave some very helpful references to the reading groups to follow this up. The term human capital, or concept of it, is, you can see, I mean, Mariátegüi's use of it, I would say, was actually interesting, and I would say innocent, in the sense that you could say he's not really making a big thing about capital, he's making a thing about human resources. And he's basically looked at a medical study which showed how poorly looked after the majority of the population in Peru were in 100 years ago now. So he uses the term, but the concept behind it is quite different. However, I mean, in colonial times, it's pretty clear that this character from the East India Company, and also in modern right-wing theory, there's quite a lot of human capital theory, and it generally sort of gravitates around the neoliberal right. So you could follow that up. I would just add that, I mean, the term social capital is closely related, I think, right? And there's quite a lot of sort of types of sociological type studies about how networks help the formation of production activity. They're not directly economic, but they're social, but they help the economic. And the World Bank really sort of fastened onto this idea. And so, you know, one example is potters in Bologna. Well, okay, so the pottery production in Bologna is massively successful, high level of pottery culture in Bologna, because a lot of the workforce and the education system and the sort of material culture around the place reflects this high level of dedication to this industry. So this forms like a social capital that any individual company or entrepreneur can draw on if they set up a pottery business. And the World Bank draws on these types of ideas very heavily. I mean, I think less so now, but I mean, about 15 years ago, this was all the rage, social capital. And Ben Fine, quite rightly, critiqued it. I mean, because basically the World Bank was using this idea to substitute for any critical social science. The last point, right? Well, Marx makes this point about the enslaved worker, but he also makes a point a bit later on, actually twice in volume 2, that enslaved labor is a form of fixed capital, as well as, I would say, and I'm sure Marx would agree, to be honest, variable capital. So this new category of fixed and variable capital. This is another theme which has come up in reading chapter 20, and I'm going to start with, well, I think the idea of depreciation again is fairly wide, well, it's very widely used in normal bourgeois orthodox accounting, because they have to deal with the deterioration of the value of their fixed assets and their replacement. So they're normally thinking of tangible fixed assets like the truck, which wears out, I don't know, 3-5 years, I don't know if that sort of length of time. Now, to explain why this is significant, I'm just going to remind you, you can go back to this, Marx's example, which was back in chapter 9, I think, right, of the use of fixed and circulating capital. So he has 80,000 fixed capital and 50,000 circulating, adding up to a total of 130,000 capital advanced. Okay, now the depreciation, whatever happens to circulation turnover, will be at the rate of 8,000 a year if it's a 10-year thing, right? But you can change the amount of capital advanced according to how fast circulating capital changes. But his sort of default example was the aggregate turnover is these two put together, and it will take just over a year for the capitalist to get back the 130 grand which they advanced originally. So that's an idea of the turnover of the total capital advanced. Now, the link, of course, is to bring in the question of profit, and the more the capital advanced needs to increase, the lower the rate of profit, and the less the capital advanced, the lower the rate of profit. Now, if you don't take depreciation into account, it would seem that the rate of profit is higher than it really is, because you've got an income, the capitalist has got an income of this extra 8,000 a year, but it's not really profit. It's what they need to put into a reserve to replace the value lost in their fixed asset. So the higher rate of profit is actually a false indicator. In this particular case, the rate of profit would be 38% rather than 44.6%. But you can see the basis of a potential misunderstanding. They need to keep an account of what degree of the revenue they get every year is actually due to depreciation rather than, if you like, genuine profit. Now, this provides the grounds for an awful lot of smoke and mirrors. Profit categories are reported in most accounting systems. I mean, there are different accounting regimes, different policies, as earnings before interest and tax, and earnings before interest and tax taking into account depreciation and amortization. And that's, if you like, the net profit is the EBITDA. Okay. Amortization is another form of depreciation which deals with intangible assets. Now, this is played around with an awful lot. I mean, Marx refers to how bourgeois accountants can play tricks in terms of the cost of repairs when profits are declared. I would say, particularly in certain industries, this playing around with this stuff depreciated or not is a massive accounting game, and it's used a lot to write off profits, to add on the depreciation can make the profit look lower than it actually was. And in mining, they have a lot of things called depletion, which is an oil extractive industries, basically. And even more, if you had the right regime, such as what Guyana's offered Exxon for the extraction of the oil there, the capitalist can write off all of the fixed capital investment, not just the depreciation, before you're starting to talk about profit. So there's I mean, if you take Marx's example, which is why I put it in, so it's the equivalent of, rather than just deducting the 8K from the 108K income, it's deducting the 80K, right? So that would end up with, rather than £50,000 a year profit, it would be a £30,000 year loss. And mining companies actually do this a lot. This is not unusual at all, right? They hardly ever pay tax. I think this is part of the UK's regime, the North Sea, for example. Okay. So what we see here is this sort of confusion about how constant capital depreciates over time. I mean, it is played with a lot to their advantage by corporations and colluding capitalist states, of course. Marx makes a very big issue about replacement of fixed capital because he presents this as a destabilizing factor within simple reproduction. And what he looks at is he looks at fixed capital in two ways, of course. One is this depreciation element, which happens year on year. Now, when the depreciation happens, it's a bookkeeping thing. There's no actual replacement of 1/10 of the machine every year. It's like there's no material movement. Okay, it's only once every 10 years that the machine gets replaced. Okay, so that's what he's saying here. Only the fixed capital that expires, i.e. on the 10th year, that's Fox, but Fox is giving a good summary of Marx. Okay, so the fixed capital that does not expire, i.e. this 8,000 a year in his example, that actually is not part of the annual product. Okay, in the sense that it doesn't get replaced year by year. So what you have to sort of imagine is the idea of, rather than 1/10 being replaced every year, rather, of any given machine, for example, rather 1 in 10 machines get replaced every year. And of course, this then becomes a sort of a statistical exercise, because there's no reason really why it should be an even flow, that 1 in every 10 years in any given year, 1 in 10 machines in any given year is actually replaced. So there's going to be fluctuations. And that's Marx's point. That's what he's getting at here, right? There's going to be fluctuations, right? And what that means is then there's going to need to be a further overhead in saving to deal with the fluctuations, right? What Marx is also doing here, which is interesting, and it will come back with Marini in particular, is he's making a distinction within Department 1, the production means of production, between the production of means of production which are fixed capital and means of production which are circulating capital. And so means of production which is fixed capital might be a truck, because trucks depreciate over several years. I mean, they move around, but that's not the point. The point is their value depreciates over several years. And this thing from that, say, like the petrol that goes into the truck, or a diesel, right? That's circulating capital, because that would be consumed as the truck is used in the production process. So what you've got then is a formative distinction within Department 1. It's not brought out to the same degree. It's not crystallized by Marx as he does in Department 2 between production of consumer goods and luxury goods. I mean, workers' consumption goods and luxury goods. But it turns out to be an important distinction. The means of production is fixed capital, means of production of circulating capital. Now, this is another of the sort of these what sort of naturalistic metaphors or analogies. All the time, I think Marx is pegging away at this. He doesn't do it in one shot. He chips away at it, right? He's saying we're not looking at equilibrium here, right? And this part of it, he says there could be a crisis generated. Although we've got reproduction on a constant scale, we're going to have a crisis of production because in any given year they might need more machines replacing, right? So even with simple reproduction, there's a possibility of crisis. There's no inherent equilibrium involved in this system, even within simple reproduction. Okay. Rather, the model should not be a simple self-correcting, that's the right term, system. It's a system which is not at all self-correcting. So yeah, the replacement of fixed capital goes on a bit more, and this one is just to talk about how you can see it today. Marx was 10 years, as I've said 2 or 3 times. According to Mandel's book, Late Capitalism, he's talking about the third technological revolution. He's talking about the 1960s, to be honest. His book came out in 1972, and he's saying, well, look, in massive chemical works in particular, and the sort of rate of technological change means fixed capital gets replaced about every 5 years these days, and you can see how big fixed capital is. Now, in his case, it is an interesting one, and I've been looking at petrochemical industry just because of the influence of Adam Hanier's book on what I've been looking at. But the petrochemical industry in the 60s, costs which went to labor were between sort of 1% and 3%. So in other words, the organic composition of capital was up to 97 to 99% constant capital, fixed and circulating. Okay. So if you are watching the recording, it's a good place to pause because that's the first section. Otherwise, I'm afraid we have to press on. Okay, so we're now going to look at chapter 21. The general movement is from simple reproduction to expanded reproduction. What does that mean? Well, Marx does this certainly in volume 1, and I think in effect he does it in volume 3 as well. And so this is the nice sort of metaphor again, which is the movement from a circle to spiral. Marx writes about his work as following the logic of capitalism in a spiral nature. And the point, of course, is that with a spiral, the movement is expanding as it rotates. So you've got this idea of an affirmation, but at the same time, a degree of negation of what's already come with a simple circular movement. And of course, the really critical thing here is in terms of sort of like the proportionality rule. I mean, and Marx develops it, he takes it further. And the reason he needs to take it further is because the point of his spiral, the spiral of capitalism, is the accumulation of capital. Now, under simple reproduction, all the surplus value gets spent by the capitalists on luxury consumption. They enjoy themselves a lot, okay? But it means that the system is just staying at the same level. There's no expansion. And actual fact, to get expansion, some of the surplus value, a proportion of it, needs to be reinvested. And this is quite familiar to us. We're very familiar with this idea from volume 1. Okay, so the scale of production increases. And to be even closer to reality, we would need to include increasing productivity, right? Now, in the expansion, money is not just a lubricant. It's not just the money of circulation, right? More and more, the point of the expansion of an individual capital and for social capital is the expansion of money capital, the addition of more money at the end of a given cycle than the beginning, or the end of a year than the beginning, the process of valorization, value which is expanding. So there's a sort of a motive to this spiral. I mean, the analogy breaks down to some degree at this point. I mean, it's only an analogy, right? The point is that there's a main spring pushing this forward. Okay, it moves forward in time, so it's not just 2-dimensional. It's definitely a movement in time. And Marx does more and more as we go through it point out that it's actually an aggregation of many individual capitals and loads of transactions between them. Okay. So really the problem he's looking at, you could actually have started it the other way around, which is how on earth does it work at all, right? Because you've got all the myriad of capitals, myriad of decisions that they're making. Okay, so that's me really talking about what Marx is about here, right? His own introduction to this section is he really starts with hoarding. I mean, John Fox is I agree with John Fox, right? His commentary on this is good, I think, right? how on earth does it work at all in a way, is what he's saying, right? And Marx shows that it is possible for it to work, only possible, right? And one of the things that Marx starts with is a question of hoarding, right? Now, hoarding is this creation of a money reserve. We've looked at fixed capital, and we've seen that over the course of 10 years, the capitalist has to keep some money back from his sales revenue in order on the 10th year to spend it to replace the fixed capital. And this is what Marx would call a hoard. I mean, we'd call it, I don't know, money reserve. While it's in the hoard, it's only potentially acting as capital. It's not actually adding any new wealth. It's there in a latent, if you like, form, and nor is it being spent on means of consumption, right? So it's a slight, well, it's not an oddity, but it's a characteristic of the system, right? That this is so. And what Marx is saying is when you look at social capital or the totality of all these different capitals, right? In order to accumulate, you've got to hoard. So all the time, what that means is there's a tendency to sell more than to buy, because what's happening is this 8,000 a year I keep going back to in the individual capitalist case. Well, you aggregate that up, I mean, it's going to be millions and billions every year, and it's not being spent. Okay, it's being put into, well, under the floorboard in olden times in the bank account today, and so on, right? Or whatever. We'll come on to whatever, but it's not being used to buy commodities until we get to the 10th year. Okay. So there's a lot more selling than buying, is what Marx is saying, right? And this is known as the problem of realization. Okay. And it's not in particular to do with the working class as such, right? In fact, the way Marx generally presents this is in terms of the replacement of the fixed element of constant capital. And he a very Marx thing, this, right? He sets up something just as an absurd thing, right? He's saying, well, the only way, one way that this could be absorbed, this counteracted, this tendency to hoard, is that sector of capitalism, capitalists who are producing money, they can buy all the surplus, which the hoarders are not buying. He says, but this doesn't make sense. And we don't have this positioning, because what we actually have is a whole series of mediations in terms of how gold enters into the circulatory system. In other words, it could be seen to be like attractive sun almost of sort of pulling in all the surplus product, which is not being bought by anybody else. And he said this doesn't work like this at all. He didn't spell it out, but he's pretty clear it doesn't work like that. All right. So Marx looks at accumulation in Department 1, and then he looks at it in Department 2. In Department 1, he's discussing this is sort of like conceptually more at the moment, right, rather than sort of his numerical examples. So there can be an expansion either by the existing capital sort of just increasing its size and scale, or it could be installation of new businesses altogether. So that's what we're talking about. But in order to do this, the capitalist has to save up. He's still resisting bringing in the credit system, so it has to come from the self-generated, funds of any given individual capital. They have to hoard parts of their money from their production. But he's saying at the same time, there'll be other capitalists who are not hoarding. They actually are spending. They're spending their hoard, right? So he's saying, well, let's just conceive of this as two types of capitalists, right? There's one type who want to sell and not buy, and then there's another type who have to offset this, who are going to buy and maybe not sell so much, right? Because actually they're in their 10th year, for example, right? They're the buyers of means of production to replace the machines, right? So A is all the time withdrawing from circulation, right? Some of the money which they've got from selling their surplus product goes back into the hoard. It doesn't go anywhere else for the time being, right? Okay. And so while he's hoarding, they're not pulling out other commodities or proportion of other commodities from the circulating system, right? But that means at the same time that other capitals, these Bs, I mean, these are fairly flexible. They're not fixed categories. They're just capitals in distinct roles in any given time, right? They're going to be withdrawing more commodities. Okay. Now, why does this matter? Let's just see how he develops his argument, right? Oh, I've got a typo there. Annual product, unfortunate mistake. So how does this work in terms of how the annual product gets reconverted, right? Right. Well, he says, first of all, it's not automatic. Adam Smith and the physiocrats are wrong about this. It's not just like one exchange for another and it all runs smoothly. We have to think about it more precisely by each category of the annual product. And we've got to think about the annual renewal of fixed capital portion of Department 2, right? Okay. So what he's saying is we're going to use the idea of fixed capital and circulating capital and its distinction between them, as well as this idea of one department capitalists selling their products to actors in the other department. Okay. And he's saying that the replacement of fixed capital from means of production into Department 2 is going to require not sort of self-adjusting transactions, but one set of transactions which are one-sided one way, and then another set of transactions which are one-sided the other way. In other words, Department 2 has to buy loads of stuff from Department 1, and then at a later point it has to sell stuff back to Department 1. But these are not at the same period, not at the same time, because of this whole thing about fixed capital, being a significant amount. Okay, somebody's helped me there. All right. Now, how this works, I'm going to illustrate with a diagram, and I'm going to illustrate it with a diagram reminding us of simple reproduction, basically. And simple reproduction works, as you will recall, by capitalists in Department 2 spending money, that's a golden line, and they buy product from Department 1, which is a surplus product of Department 1, and that becomes their means of production for the following year. Okay. Now, the materials are quite different, but the values are the same. Okay, so they will exchange that through a whole series of other money exchanges, where the capitalists in Department 1 pay their workers. The workers use the money in the pay packet to buy commodities which they consume from the production of Department 2, and this is what replenishes their labor power. So this is in what we've got here is 3 different types of transaction going on, right? Capitalists in Department 1 selling into production to capitalists in Department 2, and then workers in Department 1 buying commodities from Department 2, and also capitalists in Department 1 buying their yachts and their Lear jets from the capitalists in Department 2. So that's the third category of transaction. But all of this is a whole load. This is not a planned economy, right? This is a whole load of individual transactions going on. I mean, millions of individual transactions. So how is this different with expanded reproduction? That was a recap of simple reproduction. Okay, and in this, the amount that goes into means production to reproduce in Department 2 is the same as the surplus product in the year of Department 1. That's the equality, the condition of proportion. All right, it's a bit different when you've got expansion. Capitalists in Department 2 are going to buy their product as means of production from Department 1 again. Marx posits it, more continuous pace of circulating capital. So they're not buying everything in one go, he's saying here. They're buying the circulating capital. And there are a series of compensatory exchanges then. So they have to sell stuff back to the workers in Department 1 who use their wages to buy them and reproduce their labor power as before. But not so much now. Okay, it's about half. It's not the entire means of production. It's only the circulating component. And of course, the capitalists in Department 1, again, they can buy, if not a yacht and a Learjet, then maybe just a Learjet this year. Okay, that's the circulating capital. But then, of course, there will be a set of exchanges when the capitalists in Department 2 replace their fixed capital. So we have another set of exchanges where they get paid the capitalist Department 1 money, they buy fixed capital means of production. And again, there has to be a series of compensating exchanges for them to pay for that by selling their stuff back to the workers and the capitalists in Department 1. So he's disaggregating basically and coming down to the next level of detail. But in this disaggregation between the circulating and the fixed exchanges is the hoard. Okay, so it means that the capitalists in Department 2 have had to save up to pay for their fixed capital. That's what he's saying. And Marx is saying, right, this is getting very complicated. Marx is saying this, right? It's getting very complicated now. All right, and it gets even more complicated. Right, now the additional constant capital comes from the surplus product in Department 1. I won't go through all that text, I'll just do it by diagram. So here we have simple reproduction, the same constant capital in year 2 as there was in year 1, and it's some capitalists selling trucks, another capitalist selling lathes to each other, and that's how they do it. Now, the increase in constant capital from one year following on the next, delta C, means it has to come out, look at this detail, right? It has to come out of the surplus product in the current annual production. And therefore, there's less surplus product available. This is a crucial point Marx is making, right? So there's an increase in the portion of means of production going back to means of production, okay? And what happens is the sellers of this keep some of that as hoard. These are the A's. This is the A's and the B's coming back in now, and they buy less, okay? And they have to assume it's the B's that are expanding their production, and the A's are selling, the B's are buying, right? Remember, so B's are actually replacing more capital than A's are. This is Marx's argument. And once again, there is an impact on Department 2, because what it means is there's less money available for the capitalists to spend their surplus value on the luxury yacht. Oh, they're really suffering. You feel sorry for them, right? There were fewer yachts this year than last year. Okay. And of course, it also means that there's less constant capital replaced in Department 2. Now, this is why Marx says this is why you need a credit system to service all this hoarding. He does this a lot, right? He's saying why, from the basis of industrial capital, it makes sense that a credit system would help to overcome these problems. The third aspect is the additional variable capital, i.e., if you're going to expand production, you're going to need more labor power. And Marx says you can always do this. The capitalists can always do this by making the current workforce work more, or by bringing in new workers. It depends on the scale, the extent of the increase, right? But he says, well, volume one, I'll tell you this a lot, right? There's a lot of workers on hand. I mean, general law of accumulation, generation of reserve army of labor, not a big issue. That you can assume, the capitalists can assume they're going to be able to recruit new labor. And so just to show this one diagrammatically, more workers, it's an increase of variable capital now in the Department 1. Again, they're going to have to get the commodities to consume and the additional commodities as well from Department 2. I think Marx doesn't talk about the need for more supplies for the workers from Department 2, but I think that logically that would be the case. Okay, so accumulation in Department 2. So now we're going to have buyers in Department 2 and hoarders in Department 1. Okay, so again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the text because Marx says even on the basis of simple reproduction, you've got to have the formation of extra money capital in Department 1, and this will generate stocks of means of consumption in Department 2. And I'll try and show this one diagrammatically. Department 1 is going to be selling more to Department 2 than it buys from it. So say the increase was here, okay, but it's hoarding. It doesn't buy. What Marx is saying, this is a distinct case. Sorry, I should explain that. Marx is now saying, well, what if the hoarding is in Department 1, those capitalists, they don't buy so much. They don't buy their luxury yacht or whatever it is, right? Okay, that means that they're buying less, and there's less sold to them, which means that there's more commodities hanging around in Department 2 remaining unsold. And this is what Marx writes about here. All right, now we've so far, yeah, we know that, Carl. We know what he's talking about, simple reproduction. Now, he told us that a lot of times. Okay, so accumulation is where we're going to have some of the surplus value is not spent as revenue, but it's reinvested as capital. The issue here is to what degree that is, and surplus value and capitalization. So some of the surplus value will be capitalized. It will be returned back into the capital cycle rather than consumed, rather than enjoyed, if you like that. So there's this notion of accumulation depends on the rate of capitalization. So Marx is now putting these two ideas together. He's putting together the idea of the formation of the hoard and buyers and sellers within the capitalist community, and he's putting together the idea of fixed and circulating capital between the two departments. So as he said, it's now getting pretty complicated. Okay, and so then this is all like the qualitative stuff setting up, and then he gives us his examples. There's a bit more qualitative stuff. This one is very interesting. The whole way this argument's going, it looks like the capitalists in Department 1 end up being in a stronger position in terms of controlling their accumulation and the capitalists in Department 2 in the way Marx is presenting this. But he said, yeah, well, but they've got other things that they can do to compensate. It's very interesting that Marx brings this in, and I don't think it's been noticed in the literature. Marx says, well, if they've got stuff unsold in Department 2, what are they going to do about it? Well, they'll take it out on the workers. That's one of the things that they'll do. And he explains how there's this tendency more pronounced in Department 2, production of means of consumption, for what we would call super exploitation. He doesn't use that term, but that is actually what we're talking about here. Okay, so we're beginning to move away from any sort of supposed symmetry between the two departments and a particular motive for increasing exploitation within the capitalist system. Fox gives us a good expression algebraically. So there's two important parameters. Okay, one is this, what I've already mentioned, the rate of capitalization, which is that what is the proportion of the surplus value which is going to be reinvested rather than just spent on luxury consumption. That's one variable he introduces. The other variable he introduces is what's it going to be spent on if it's reinvested, and he has a particular formulation of the composition of capital, which is this K, which is that both of these are maximum 1. Okay, so the capitalization rate at its top end would be 1. In other words, all the surplus value gets reinvested, and it would be 0 if none of the surplus value gets reinvested. And the composition of capital, the way he's formulated it, again, the maximum is 1. If all the capital, I mean, it's a what's the word, a vanishing limit, but we'll say if all the capital was constant capital, then K would be 1. If all of the capital was variable capital, K would be 0. So it's going to be between 0 and 1 again. Okay. And so that's his formula. He's saying that the constant capital in the next year will be the sum of the constant capital in the current year plus the expansion from the appropriated surplus value, which is reinvested into production of constant capital. And the variable capital is sort of the other side of what's from the surplus value that's invested. Some of it's invested in constant capital and the rest is invested in variable capital to expand the workforce. And the same basically in Department 2. Let me try and explain this one by a diagram. So this is the basic equality which we came to. Marx explained to us in simple reproduction that the total surplus product across the 2 departments is equal to the surplus to the total consumer goods produced in Department 2. And once you've got that equality, if you take away the constant capital reproduced in Department 1, what you're left with is the new value produced in means production must equal that which is invested as constant capital as means production in Department 2. That's where we got to with simple reproduction, and that looks like that. Marx has changed these numbers a bit, and what you'll notice is he's got a different he ends up with the same total result, but he breaks it down differently. That used to be 2000 was it 2000 500 that's right. So what he's done is he's reduced the constant capital. So the value composition here, the organic composition, is 2 to 1. Here it's 4 to 1. So this one is more capital intensive than this department, and that's a move to reality, I think. Okay, so he's expanding reproduction. He's reduced the size of Department 2 in terms of, not in terms of its total product, but in terms of the constant capital is reduced, because it used to be 2 and now it's down to 1.5. The amount of capital advanced I think is also reduced. Yes, it has. It's gone down from 2.5 to 2.25, but with the same output result of 3,000. Okay. So what we've got is a lower organic composition of capital in Department 2. What Marx does is he explains how this works, detail figures. He's going to end up with a 10% rate of expansion in Department 1, but less than that rate of expansion in Department 2 from this starting point. And so the capital gets used up, but there needs to be the constant capital product of means of production needs to expand and when it's being reproduced. So some of the means of production, which is part of the surplus product, gets included and taken up the next year as part of the means of production in that department. I'll give you the example. Marx says it's quite important, this, because it depends on the material product, whether you can do this or not. I mean, if that was a yacht, you can't really use a yacht in terms of production, means of production. But if it's trucks, then rather than being sending off to Department 2 to deliver the peas or whatever, you can put them into Department 1 to help make stuff for more trucks. What this means is that because this surplus product, the surplus value is now being used otherwise back into Department 1, there's less available to Department 2, which is why he reduced the starting point. Because what he wants to show is year 1, 1.5, year 2, 1.6. So he wants to show some expansion. And the way he's fiddled the figures a little bit, the way he's done that is he's got a lower starting point for Department 2, so he can get some expansion in. Okay, so that's his first case schema. Now, it would be interesting, does Fox's formula work? We plug, against his formula, we plug in the numbers. It definitely works for year 1. We get the same results that Marx gave us from the formula. That's all good. So far, so good. In year 2 as well. In year 3, yeah, so Fox wins. He's working very nicely. Thank you. So we've got an algebraic expression which we can apply to different examples. And so therefore, we've got more of an idea of the general rule. And so far, it's all conforming with Marx's result. However, Marx is just like so obsessive it's not true. He just won't let sleeping dogs lie. And so he keeps on going. And what he finds actually in the next year, it's not quite the same as you might expect. If we put in the figures, the same rate of capitalization and the same organic composition of capital, we come up with a result which is not Marx's result. So something's gone wrong. What's gone wrong? There's a twist in this tale, and the twist is actually in Department 2, the rate of capitalization has to increase to keep in proportion with Department 1. What does that mean? It means that some of the surplus value of Department 2 is even more of it has to go into reinvestment in Department 2 to keep up. and that's Marx's adjustment. So the rate of capitalization, as we call it, has to increase. Okay, so there's actually Fox needs a little bit of trimming in order to get the right result. I'll stop my puns before. All right, Mark's got a second example, which I'm not going to work through in any detail. It's a similar example, but he's making the figures even more realistic in terms of the degree of organic composition and so on. So what he's coming now is that we're getting towards conclusions, right? The proportionality is different. The necessary relationship is different, right? And actually, you've got to have more surplus product in department 1 being produced than is consumed in next year's means production department 2, right? Because it's got to provide to the extra growth in department 1, and it's got to be provide for the extra growth in department 2 as well. And this generates this whole sort of series of knock-on consequences. Once again, he's got a ideological counter to the capitalist class, which we probably don't have time to go into, but I'll just now try to finish this in general comments, right? So this is the general rule, which Marx comes up with, right? With production on an increasing capital basis, the new value of means production must be equal to the means production which is bought and applied in department 2 for the following year, plus that which is used to expand production in department 1, plus that which is used to expand production in department 2. And when you say like that, that's pretty obvious. That's not a hard rule to understand, right? So that's what all this detail working out has given us. And these last two are easily skipped by, I think, in terms of time. Okay, in terms of taking a step back, I mean, if you are watching the recording, you might want to take another break. This won't take very long, but I just do want to make these points. It's very clear that the critique of Adam Smith just doesn't stop, right? I mean, we know the starting point of it, which is how Adam Smith sees value or presents value as a sort of an addition of its elements, and that also that Smith missed the significance of constant capital being transferred. And Marx, we've seen, deals with this directly in 2 chapters, but it actually runs through quite a lot of the sections of chapter 20 as well. He does come back to his critique of Smith quite a lot. This is the limit of the theory of value from the bourgeois standpoint, because Smith accepted that labor produced value, right? He agreed with labor theory of value, but he had a problem, right? Because his whole class instinct was that it's towards industrial capital as a producer of value. And the only way that he really solved this is that labor theory of value worked before capitalism, but it no longer holds within capitalism. Now, Ricardo's solution to this was that there are exceptions to the law of value, but it still holds within capitalism. So that they both had a challenge, which was to explain how the labor theory of value holds in a capitalist system. And it's Marx who solved that challenge, right? And his basic solution is that it holds, but in a very contradictory way, because it expresses a fundamental contradiction that cannot be itself resolved except by systemic overthrow. So this is why we claim that Marx has a scientific consciousness for socialist revolution. Okay, so what we can see after Smith and Ricardo is that bourgeois political economy actually abandoned an objective view of value and started to substitute very subjective views of value. Okay, and then there was a further development, which is this subjectivity became reintroduced within versions of Marxism. So that's one observation. But why does Marx spend so much time on Smith, and how do we relate to it today? The second observation is this. You're familiar with this diagram, right? Now, what Marx does between the Grundrisse and volume the capital is he replaces what he earlier called capital in general with industrial capital. Most of Capital, as the 3 volumes, is about industrial capital. And we've seen in each volume, he comes to the social totality, but each time he comes to it from a different perspective. And he does it 3 times. So in a way, well, you can see productive, commodity, money, capital. In a way, he has to do something in volume 2 about the social totality. He has to look at totality from the point of view of the movement of commodity capital, the sort of conditions of existence at a systemic level of commodity capital. And so, you know, if it wasn't there, he'd have to write it, but he did write it. And so after these 3 forms of 3 perspectives, I should say, on industrial capital, that's when he moves into the question of commercial capital, banking, and so on. That's one of the reasons, it's not the whole reason, but that's why one of the reasons Marx doesn't go into the credit system. He wants to keep the integrity of the explanation at the level of industrial capital as that which stands for capital in general. Okay. And just as an aside, which is an important one, a commodity, what he calls a commodity, develops in each of these steps in the totality as well. The totality is composed of commodities, which are simple commodities, which are commodities by labor exploited, and they become in volume 2 the value form becomes the capital form. These are commodity capital. So what is a commodity is now seen differently, and that changes again in volume 3. Okay, these points we've learned from volume 2. I will go through these very quickly. The really important point is the second one here, right? This is an abstract model, but it is an abstract model of capitalism. That's the limit of the abstraction, is it's the capitalist system, because all the time it's not just about reproduction, it's about how money is involved in the processes of reproduction. Okay, so it's specific, and all the anarchic elements which come out are related to this connection between the movement of commodities and the role that money plays in their circulation. So it's not an equilibrium model. The role is it's wrong to read it as an equilibrium model, and I think Marx several times explained that it's not. If you had a naive reading of it, and we all are naive when we first start with this, right, you can see a sort of organicist sort of complementarity between the two departments, but the more it goes on, the more that just breaks down, and that's the way Marx wrote it, which maybe he could have written it differently, right? But that's what we got. So the equilibrium model, I think, if you read it all the way through and study it all the way through, is very much a prejudice of those interpreters who read it this way. I don't think it comes from the content of the book really at all. So I firmly agree with Marx on this. I still think he's got a problem with money. I don't think it quite works still. We'll come back to this because Luxemburg didn't think it quite worked anyway, but from a different point of view. But I'm recording my concern there. But what I think is a strength of Marx is that what he does show is that with these money commodity exchanges, we've still got a class relation, right? You can't say, oh, it's just buyers and sellers. No, it's capitalist buyers and capitalist sellers and worker buyers and worker sellers. So he never loses the class perspective, right? And finally, I think that this is the importance of a negative result. What do I mean by this, right? There isn't any inherent tendency to proportionality, either in reproduction or expanded reproduction. They're neither inherently harmonious nor inherently driven to crisis. I mean, you can see that a crisis is possible. You could also see the forms that it might take when there isn't systemic unity, like there's disproportions, there's a lack of money to buy in certain areas, certain classes, and so on, right? Now, this is a big point. I've mentioned the development of the commodity, and what I'm saying here is we have to have a concept of the commodity which is beyond the simple one of a combination of use value and exchange value as the product of labor produced for sale, right? It's insufficient to explain capitalist crisis, and what Marx has done in these department of production has taken use value and exchange value to its ultimate in terms of the totality of the system, but it's not yet enough to explain why capitalism goes into crisis. So that's why we need volume 3, because the driver is the capital relation in terms of its drive for accumulation, its drive for profitability. And what Marx does in volume 3 is he explains that necessarily the drive for profitability of industrial capital drives the system into a crisis of profitability. And then he brings in the other forms. And that's also why, by the way, he delays credit system, because he wants to establish the movement of the industrial rate of profit before credit system. So the fundamental antagonism of capitalist commodities is not use value and exchange value. That's the terrain on which the antagonism is played out. The dynamic involves them completely, right? But it is because they are the product, they are capitalist commodities. They're the product of a class antagonism, both in their production and in their form of presentation in circulation. So that's my last takeaway. And these now, so all will be revealed in the next volume, I hope. So here's some references, and that's me finished my presentation. And I do apologize for the length of time. I hope it was worth it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Welcome to this Monday's Capital lecture series delivered by Andy. Yeah, we are still on Capital Volume 2. Andy, remind us, is that the last lecture in that particular series? Or
there'll be one more. This is the penultimate lecture.
That is the penultimate lecture. Thanks for the clarification. And we look at the debates after Marx, yeah, in today's session. And so we do it in the usual way, 50 minutes or a few more if you need for you, Andy, and then we still have ample time for questions and discussions. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, let's go with that. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, this is the 9th of 10 lectures, and we're going to look at the debate after Marx on the departmental schemas, which is part 3 of volume 2, and how they were used as a sort of theoretical launching point to explain capitalist imperialism, especially the debate around Rosa Luxemburg's contribution. So this is what we'll cover today. It's quite a lot and slightly challenged on time. Some of the slides I will just mention, and just they're available for sharing, and I won't read it all out, but the material will be there. So I'm going to just do a quick review, because there are a couple of issues that in the reading groups have come up which I think are worth reflecting on. And in preparing for this, what I discovered is there's a lot more to sort of ground this discussion about Rosa Luxemburg's contribution. If we take a step back, if you like, in time, and go back to Marx and Lenin, and then Rosa Luxemburg and the responses to her. So that's the basic structure of it. What's very striking in the generation after Marx, so we're talking about the 1890s into the 1900s, is there was an acceleration of events, without a doubt. And we're talking about the First World War, the 2 revolutions in 1917 in Russia, and so the political economy was very close to different political positions that different Marxists took. And so I'll sort of comment on that, if you like, the political tendencies as well as the theoretical traditions. Also, I mean, it definitely is the case that Rosa Luxemburg's contribution has made a comeback in recent years, and so I'd like to make some sort of reflections on that as well. And finally, this is the penultimate lecture, because I think there's quite a lot of loose ends, to be honest with you. And I think that there was a genuinely clarifying and, in a sense, simplifying contribution made by the next theoretical generation of the 1960s and 70s, and in particular that by Marini and the Marxist dependency theory. So I'm not going to tie everything up in a neat bow this time round, and also some of the content, because there is so much content, I have delayed, in particular the quite important contribution from Grossman, I'll put back till next time. So this issue comes up in the contribution by Breyer. It's quite interesting what he has to say. He compares the Penguin translation, which is known as the Fernbach translation, with another translation which is in the Marx and Engels collected works, which is the sort of Soviet published team, right? And the conceptual distinction is between aggregate social capital, which we know part 3 of volume 2. The first 2 parts have been about individual capital as a representative of the system. And then Marx changes the gear, as he does in each volume, and looks at the social totality, this time from the point of view of circulation. But what is a total social capital is the point that's being made here. And there is a distinction which we do come across quite a lot in part 3, especially when we're trying to get to terms with it in the introduction. Are we talking about something which is the sum of the individual parts, or are we, as an aggregation, if you like, are we talking about a level where it itself is moving as a totality? And that comes out in the translation of the German term. And what Breyer points out is the Fernbach translation translates this term quite differently to the Untermann translation, right? And so the Untermann translation only uses it, it translates the German original as total social capital 5 times out of the 78 which it occurs, where it's very clear Marx is talking about the movement of the totality. In other circumstances, he uses the term aggregate social capital, whereas the Penguin translation is always about total social capital. Okay. Now, why is this important? It's very clear that part 3 is a very abstracted view of capitalist reproduction, but there is also a question of what do we mean by abstraction, right? And I mean, is the whole more important than the parts, and what's the relation between the parts and the whole, right? And what we read when we first started reading chapter 20 is there's a slight tendency to suggest that it's an organic whole. And that goes along with the idea that things are in equilibrium, that it's harmonious, and so on. Now, what Marx does in chapter 20 under simple reproduction is he more and more shows that that is not the case, right? But without the signposting, it's fairly understandable why one would think that was the default, was harmony, and then these were exceptions to the rule. But in actual fact, I think Marx's argument is going in a different direction, right? The other thing about this is, and this relates to the later discussion, which is, how realistic are the numbers that Marx is using? I mean, are they actual cases, or are they simply illustrating a relatively abstracted view? Okay, so that happens to be quite a lot behind this issue of translation of what we're talking about here. Now, you're very familiar from my other lectures, I think, with this diagram, because I use it quite a lot to explain the overall structure of the 3 volumes. It's kind of like a 3 by 3 matrix, And what I want to emphasize this time, right, is that volume 2 is different to volume 1 and volume 3 when we're talking about the totality. In volume 1, the totality is summed up by the general law of capital accumulation. So the totality is seen from the perspective of reproducing class relations at the same time as capital accumulates. The accumulation of capital reproduces a surplus population and so on. Okay, so it's a class relation. And in volume 3, part 3 of volume 3, it's again a systemic totality, this time from the point of view of profit. And again, there's a law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, I think volume 2, the behavior in terms of circulation, I don't think the claim that Marx is making here is not as strong as a law, right? It's much more like, for the system to function at all, there must be a proportionality. You can say that that's a law, but it's a sort of law in the weaker sense of the term, I would say, right? It's a guiding rule which needs to take place for the system to function, right? Okay, so why am I saying this? It's because the necessity is there in volumes 1 and 3, and there's much more room for interpretation about how this matters. And this matters when it comes to crisis. Okay, volume 3, part 3 ends with 2 words, hence crisis. So it's a very determined, it could be down to the editing, but the argument is there. It culminates in this idea of the necessity of a capitalist crisis, right? But volume 2's part 3 that we've been reading lacks this same determination of necessity of how the system will work. It could go one way, it could go another way. It's quite open, I think. There's a lot of potential contingency there, right? So in order to reach the categorical challenge, which Marx's argument is assembling bit by bit in this very patient sort of long distance way with which he writes Capital, the categorical challenge is not yet present in volume 2, is my point of view, right? We need to read and study volume 3 to really get to the categorical challenge. And this is connected with the movement from surplus value to profit. Marx has not yet, he's given us a lot of hints, a lot of indicators, but he's not yet explained profit as distinct from surplus value. And that's what he does in volume 3. And that's because the reason I'm saying we don't get the full determinacy here is because Marx's theory of crisis in volume 3 is that a capitalist crisis come about due to crisis of profitability. Okay, so we're not there yet. This is a building block to get us there. The other reflection is just in reading chapter 21, which is a chapter on expanding reproduction. The first one is just the rule of proportionality changes. We've encountered this. It's no longer the case that the surplus plus the variable capital, i.e. the new value in means of production, must equal the means of production that are invested next time round in department 2, means of consumption. Marx says this can't be the case, and he works through an example where the inequality, he uses the numbers, the same illustration as he used for simple reproduction, and basically it doesn't work. So he changes the numbers. Now, this is not just an artificial trick by Marx. It's rather he's changing the point of starting point. He has to change the starting point because there's an expansion, and the expansion rule is a different rule of proportionality between the two departments. So, I mean, I was saying that this is Marx's sidestepping the problem. I don't think he is actually, but I don't think he fully spells out. He indicates a solution, but he doesn't fully spell out the different logic of here of capital in expansion rather than simple reproduction. I also think that, having read it through again, it's pretty clear that chapter 21 is quite incomplete. I mean, if you think of not only the length of chapter 20 and all these sort of further, more advanced topics, but all the time he's introducing more aspects of the concrete reality, the different types of transaction, the way fixed capital and circulating capital operate is different, and they move differently between the two departments. And that is an inherent sort of instability in the system. He actually does on the penultimate page and the last page, I think, just touch on the hoards and on the fixed and circulating capital, but in no way is it developed in the same sort of minute, meticulous, incredibly detailed way that he does in the other parts of this book, right? So what I'm trying to say is it's pretty clear that chapter 21 was quite initial in terms of what content could have come, right? So what you get is a similar situation where it appears to be more in potential equilibrium as it expands, then I think is justified. If you were to map some of the problems which Marx identifies for simple reproduction into expanded reproduction, and it will get even more complicated because it is more complicated. You can see it's not smooth run-ins. It won't be smooth run-ins at all, right? Okay. So there's a caveat also about part 3 overall, right? This is still circulation, It's a mechanical first rendering, right? And there's quite a lot that I think if you were to be true to the, well, it's interpretive point, right? It's my interpretation, right? If one is true to the spirit of what Marx is doing, you'd have to bring in these complications once again. Okay. My last point on chapter 21 is it is the fair comment that, I mean, if you want to get the general rule expressed, there are different ways of doing it. Marx uses his text and his accumulated illustrations. You can try to do it diagrammatically, and you can do it with algebra. So what I'm trying to explain here is that there have been attempts from extending Marx to represent the proportionality rule for expanded reproduction algebraically. And so you can see highlighted in blue my statement of what I think that rule is. It's obviously based on Marx. It's not original. It's just my understanding of what Marx is telling us, right? Which is that the portion of department's new value product is either reinvested as an increase in variable capital, or there is some still spent on luxuries, and that must equal the expanded constant capital reproduced in department 2. Okay, now Bukharin sets up a notation. So the V1 and the beta 1V, they're basically the variable capital next time round plus the same as this time round, plus the increased variable capital, right? And this is the surplus value. Alpha is the surplus value spent on luxuries, right? So the surplus value has now been divided, yeah, between expanding variable capital and also off here, but somewhere else, expanding constant capital and spent on luxuries. And that is all means of production, but it's exchanged. And what it's exchanged for must be the means of production that are also what it is sold, and that selling is what's here. It must be equal to the expanded means of production for the department 2. Now Marx does start to develop his own notation, but right towards the very end. Okay, and I've extended it to take account in similar terms, and I introduced Fox's notation. Actually, although it looks very complicated, when you break it down, I think Fox's notation is the best because he distinguishes between the two parts that break down the surplus value. That part of surplus value, which is turned back into accumulation, there are two aspects to it, which is one is just the rate which is put into a capitalist enjoying luxury products and the rate which they reinvest. And then within that, the rate at which they reinvest is subdivided into how much is constant capital, extra constant capital, and how much is extra variable capital. So those are the two variables he's putting in there. Okay, so if we take Marx's work example, this is the first one that works for him. Okay, and there's an equality here between the numbers. Work out that 1,600 is the equal amount. Okay, that's what would be put into expanded reproduction, for example, of department 2 the following year. Constant capital. All right. There is a wrinkle in Marx's worked example, okay, and that is actually, if you look at this carefully, you'll notice that these two departments have got different organic compositions. The organic composition of department 1 is, i.e., it's more capital intensive using layman's language than department 2 is, right? 4-to-1 and 2-to-1. Now, that generates a slight wrinkle in Marx's worked example, which he didn't particularly solve. Okay, he just adjusted his example, but in actual fact, the later literature thinks this through better, and there is a question mark about how to explain accumulation between the two departments when they have different organic compositions of capital. And I'll come back to that.
Andy, could you go over those?
This is a lecture. It's not a dialogue. Can you go on mute, please, because we're recording. I will go over under questions. Now, the continuing correlation is that the rates of accumulation in both departments are in inverse proportion to their organic compositions. We'll come back to this. I mean, sorry to be a bit abrupt, but we need to get through the material and then we can discuss it. This is the outline of Marx's solution, right? But all the time when we're studying this, it's kind of like it's always there, right? Hanging there. Why are we doing this? Why are we studying this? What is the problem that this is actually solving? So we've got a solution, but what's the problem? Now, you have to take 2 steps back, really, to understand what the problem is, right? The most immediate problem, which is how Marx actually introduces it. Marx introduces it in terms of response to Adam Smith, but conceptually, how Marx really introduces this is along the lines of how does capitalism expand and reproduce itself as capital accumulation through circulation? Okay, how does capitalism expand through the buying and selling of commodities for money in markets? How does that work, right? And that's what he's actually showing us how it works in his departmental schema, right? But there's a deeper question behind that question, right? Which is, that's a how question, but there's also a question about the functioning of capitalism as a system. Can it function in a non-crisis way, or must it go into crisis? And I'm saying that because I now want to change gear and go back to the sort of the deeper theoretical inheritance before Marx, right? And this is where the politics and the political economy begin to merge, right? So Marx is wrestling this in the Grundrisse back in, it's an earlier 10 years before Capital. Many people see this as the first draft of Capital. And the debate is between two trends before Marx, right? And the first and better known trend is that of Ricardo and Say, and they represent a last word in bourgeois economics before Marx, basically, right? And they conceive of the system as what this is very Marxian, Hegelian Marx, if you like, terms, as the self-realization of capital. What does that mean? It means that there are no real barriers to the expansion of productive capital in circulation. Circulation does not, in its essentially does not provide an obstacle to the expansion of capital. They're very optimistic. They see the capitalist system as expanding unproblematically, and they don't see any necessity of the system going into crisis, right? So what we've got here is, and this is, I'm quoting Marx here in the Grundrisse, he's saying they have therefore grasped the positive essence of capital more correctly and deeply than those who, like Sismondi, emphasize the barriers of consumption, right? So it's all about, the Grundrisse is structured around the question of production and consumption. And Marx is saying, well, actually, Ricardo is right to say that production trumps consumption. Okay, if you like, correct? Okay, and that's its universal tendency. Consumption is a particular issue, but it's not the general issue of capitalism. Okay, now the qualification which you have to begin to understand, which Marx will put on this as we go through it, right, is the problem with Ricardo's universalism, the capitalist mode of production, is that they don't see any necessity of crisis built into the nature of the system. There's no inbuilt necessary contradiction in the system, right? Now, a bit later on, a few years later, Marx has got a very detailed consideration of Sismondi. Now, Sismondi is a critic of capitalism, but from a bourgeois point of view, if you accept that sort of contradiction, right? Okay. Sismondi recognizes that there are contradictions in capitalist production. And the principal contradiction that Sismondi speaks about is that the production of the commodities exceeds the capacity of workers to consume them. The workers do not have enough money to buy the commodities that have been produced. Okay, and he sees this as the main inevitable reason why the system will go into crisis. So crises are inevitable, right? So again, Marx has got a double sort of opinion about this, right? He likes the fact that Sismondi sees the inevitability of crisis, right? But he doesn't agree with the cause of the crisis. The nature of the contradiction that Sismondi sees is different to the nature of the contradiction that Marx begins to develop or is developing, especially around this time, right? There is another issue with Sismondi's view, right? Which is, as Marx comments, this is all me quoting Marx here, right? His view, which is known as the underconsumptionist view, was easily appropriated for completely reactionary purposes by Thomas Malthus. He says, well, if you want the system to work, then we're going to need to have somebody to consume all this excess commodity production. Hey, we got landlords. They can consume the excess commodity production and then everybody's going to be happy, right? So Malthus was a complete reactionary apologist for landlordism, but he actually bolted that reactionary position onto the theoretical argument, or the more theoretical argument, let's say, of Sismondi, which is the system produces more commodities than be consumed by the capitalist class and the working class. Okay, and that causes crisis. Now, at this time, Marx was still working out his theory of crisis. I mean, he had a very strong directional impulse that the crisis is inherent in the system, but actually articulating what that is, he really gets there around about 1863 and brings it all out in his subsequent work. Okay, so he's very much arguing against Ricardo, but also in a different sense against Sismondi as well. Okay, now this is important for everything that comes next. The other thing to note, just in terms of the sort of the generations of Marxists studying this stuff, is the Grundrisse wasn't actually published until about nearly 100 years after it was. There were only notes, right? They weren't published. And the notes on theories of surplus value were published by Kautsky, actually, in 1905 to 1910. There's 3 volumes of them. So the first 10 years or so after Engels' death, people didn't know about this. But then in this sort of few years, just before the First World War, they did become known. And that just a sort of circumstance which is slightly relevant. Okay. This writer is a blog which I saw this blog just came out last week. Okay, 2 weeks ago now, and I think it's really good. This blog post, it's by, I think it's pseudonym Sam Williams in the States, right? And by coincidence, he returned to this debate, and I've just shown you his appreciation of the debate, right? About this possibility of a general glut of commodities. And again, I'm not going to read it all out, but you can see he's making the point exactly that I would make, that Malthus is able to take Sismondi's crisis theory, which is the underconsumption, right, and give it a reactionary twist. What I like about what Sam says is that there's also an element of truth to underconsumption's position, right? I mean, Marx does not deny, on the contrary, he recognizes that under capitalist system, workers don't get to consume enough, right, to have a decent standard of living, right, particularly in his time, when you talk about British workers in his time, right? But the issue is, why is that the case, right? And this is the repositioning of the problem by Marx, right? All the time he brings it back to, well, the reason is underlying everything is you got to look at why capitalists produce the commodities at all, right? They don't produce them for its own sake. It's not production for production's sake. It's to make a profit, right? And so you have to look at what will make the capitalist more profit as the guiding light as to how the system works, okay? So Marx recognizes that the underconsumptionists have a point of view, but he sees the reason for the problem at a different level, if you like, right? Now, this has political consequences to this day, because underconsumptionists who aren't reactionary like Malthus, but who sort of have a common theoretical understanding, i.e. they're in favor of the working class, right, argue, you will recognize this argument, I'm sure, to this day, that if wages are raised and if political action is taken, right, then you don't need to get rid of capitalism to come out of the crisis, right? You can solve the crisis simply, if only capitalists would pay their workers more, that would solve the crisis, right? Marx didn't agree with that position, right? And if it were true, then you wouldn't need to be a revolutionary, okay, basically, because there'd always be a way to solve the crisis within the system, within the social relations of capitalism, right? So again, William's contribution, which I think I really encourage you to read it, I think he positions it very well, actually, right, is it comes back to the Ricardo Say tradition. Say is famous for sort of saying supply and demand will always equal out in the market, right? It's a belief in the market, basically. And this is the classical liberal economist answer, right? That markets are in automatic harmony. Now, I think you can begin to feel how all of this kind of pertains on the very, what's the word, technical department of production discussion, and I try to bring the sort of broader political economy issues and the department of production together. And it's not me who first brought them together. The first time these issues came together was in Russia in the late 19th century. And so what I'm going to do is to explain that context, and then I'll seek to explain the context of imperialism. And I can see we're challenged on time, but we'll do our best. There's a great continuity, actually, between the late Marx and the early Lenin, and the connection is Engels. I mean, Marx and Engels were asked to adjudicate in a debate between two wings of the early Marxists in Russia. The Zazulich, who was closest to the populists, and Plekhanov, who was really the father of legal Marxism. They were basically asking of Marx and Engels through correspondence, would capitalism take hold in Russia? Okay. And Marx's answer was, well, the jury's out. We'll see. He didn't give a definitive answer. And he said, of course, that answer to that question brings up another question, is what's going to be the nature of the revolution, right? What is the class alignment, if you like, the class content of what they all felt was the forthcoming revolution in Russia, even like 50 years before. Marx's point there is that there will be a contingency between the revolutions in Russia and Western Europe. Okay, so the internal and the external are already sort of connected in the Marxist positioning. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, lastly because of time, but Engels and Lenin independently, after Marx had died, both came to the view that in fact capitalism was taking hold in Russia. And the biggest signifier of that was the catastrophic famine in 1891, which is very similar, not the same, but similar to similar famines in other parts of the world where capitalism was taking hold. In late Victorian Holocaust, it's called. The book talks about Brazil, talks about China, talks about India, you could even say Ireland and so on, right? So the capitalist market was taking hold, and it meant that if people couldn't pay, they would starve. Okay, so this is the violence of the spread of capitalism through market mechanisms. And so the early Marxists in Russia, after Marx and Engels go, Lenin emerges very quickly as a young man as somebody who argues a particular position about the development of market relations and capitalism in Russia. Okay, And so I'm not really I'm not going to go through all of this. It is extremely interesting politically, right, and the development of Lenin's position. And I would just summarize it by saying that Lenin changed his position as reality changed. It wasn't like he didn't change it in thin air. He changed it because reality was changing between the different character of the revolution which they were seeking to make. And the sort of the connecting broad themes were both internal and external. The internal theme, overriding theme completely, was the connection between the proletariat and the peasantry. And the external theme, if you like, the international theme, was the question of how Western European capitalism was becoming more and more overtly imperialist. I mean, it always had been, but it began to fight over who gets to colonize peoples. So what's of interest is what's the movement between Lenin and Luxemburg, right? They both were politically converging against imperialism, but theoretically they took different paths. Luxemburg was the best of a very bad lot, as it turned out, which is Western European social democracy. Lenin didn't agree with Luxemburg's major work in 1913, but he definitely respected her. And I mean, I think that the respect was mutual. There's some sort of like conflicting evidence on that, right? This one I'll explain more in the next slide, but they both had opinions about Germany and Russia. I mean, their weight was in different, their involvement was different in both cases, but Luxemburg knew a lot about Russia, and so expressed herself theoretically in relation to Russia as well, right? Lenin's position on Russia was very much in the development of capitalism in Russia, right? Which is that there is a extension of capitalist relations in the countryside and in industry, right, full of contradictions, which would generate two revolutions, a democratic one and a socialist one, right? So it's a moving dialectic of structural contradictions. That's, if you like, the culmination of the early Lenin. And in that positioning, he's in polemical disagreement with these two other trends on the Russian left, okay? Now what we're seeing now is a continuity between what Marx had to say about Ricardo and Sismondi and what Lenin dealt with in terms of these three political positions, right? So the most widespread position at the early 1890s were the populists, right? And they basically argued that there would be a Russian road to socialism without going through capitalism, so long as it could be based on the peasantry, make the revolution against Tsarism, right? The legal Marxists, so capitalism didn't have to take hold, right? That's the point, right? The legal Marxists were the polar opposite. They said capitalism would take hold and it would be very successful. And because it would be expanding indefinitely, there was no real objective basis for making a revolution. So they were using Marx's arguments to deny the need for revolution. Okay. And then you had Lenin, who was positioned critical of both positions, right? He said that capitalism is taking hold, but it is full of developing contradictions. And we need to prepare for its complete overthrow. But in order to prepare for it, we need to get rid of the Tsar and we need to ally with the peasantry. And that alliance will shift as we approach the socialist revolution. So you can see it's quite a dynamic and moving political positioning. Now, Lenin is more critical of Sismondi than Marx was. He hadn't read Marx on Sismondi, it wasn't available to him. But he treats Sismondi as a petty bourgeois critic, basically. He says, yeah, he's against capitalism, but the way he's critiquing it is sentimental and it's romanticizing the real situation. Certainly the Sismondians in Russia were romanticizing the real conditions of the peasantry, right? The peasantry don't want a return to pre-capitalism. They also need a fight for socialism, right? So theoretically, he's saying they put an immediate connection between production and consumption, right? That production and consumption are sort of like there's no mediation between them, right? And he argues that Marx admits or recognizes that there's a connection, but it's a more indirect one. Production and consumption aren't the same thing. You have to look at how markets really work, right? And he argues that Marx saw consumption as following production. That's Lenin's argument, right? Production leads consumption in the capitalist system. So he connects the Narodnik political position with a petty bourgeois economic understanding, economic critique of capitalism, right? He also critiques the legal Marxists. Marini's commentary in Volume 2 brings this out particularly well. I mean, I think Marini shows us how well and thoroughly he had studied this whole debate, right? Now, what is said of the legal Marxists, right, is that they turn Marx into something that he's not, right? They actually make him make his argument at the parts of production something which it isn't, okay? And what they do is to gravitate towards any idea of harmony, equilibrium, and so on, which they can extract from the departments of production chapters, right? So there you get this sort of repetition of these trends of thought. It's very technical. We've seen that in the departments of production, right? But in the end, it's about what's the nature of capitalist accumulation, right? So in evaluating Lenin so far, I'm just using Palois here, right? He's more critical of the populist than he is of the legal Marxists economically, but politically, he's more critical of the legal Marxists than he is of the populist, if that makes sense, right? Okay. There is one issue with this, what I would call the early Lenin, is he's very loyal in his defense of Marx. Well, Marx says that the international movements of commodities, the market exchanges of imports and exports, don't in principle matter to the general solution. And Lenin defends that position. I don't think that position is defensible as soon as you think about capitalism as imperialism, which is what we're going to shortly come on to, right? So Rostolsky and Palois have different evaluations of Lenin on this. Rostolsky thinks that Lenin was actually too close to the legal Marxists, and it's a lot of detail in that debate, right? Let's get on to Luxemburg. Luxemburg was a revolutionary, right? She grew up in Poland. She was Jewish. She was a woman. She was, in the context of Germany and Poland, definitely from an oppressed nation. She came into prominence age in the late 20s when she wrote against an open reformism of Bernstein. She became quite a leading figure, educator, propagandist, I would say, in the German Social Democratic Party. She advocated mass action, spontaneous mass action, rather than political party organization. That would be interesting to discuss why that was. She was actually critical of the October Revolution, but the real point of connection with Lenin, of course, was her opposition to imperialism, in which she was, politically without fault, really. I mean, she spoke very firmly against the rise of German militarism. She proposed a motion in 1907, an international conference, the Second International, to take workers to take action against the war if the war broke out. German Social Democracy was the biggest party at the time. It split three ways, and the important middle position, which was led by Kautsky, became known as the pacifist center. So as well as the open right-wing opportunists who were basically embracing capitalism and imperialism, you had this sort of left social democratic center around Kautsky, who she was Luxemburg was much more resolute in her opposition to imperialism than Kautsky turned out to be. She had a political difference with Lenin on the right of nation self-determination. She didn't trust the national bourgeoisie. Lenin explains this in terms of her own particular experience of Poland. So there were differences, right? But in terms of opposition to imperialism and militarism, they very strongly coincided. She was in prison for most of the First World War. She'd been imprisoned, right? But she was definitely on the left, the Zimmerwald left, against the war. Okay. Also, and it's barely mentioned in most of the political sort of evaluations of Luxemburg, is she was closely allied with Clara Zetkin, and the first conference against the war was actually of socialist women, not the Zimmerwald left conference, but the Socialist Women Unite Against War, less known about. Now, from 1907 to the outbreak of First World War in 1914, there's a political ferment, I should say. Lenin writes about this Stuttgart conference very, very tellingly. He's saying basically German social democracy supports war, or at least the opportunist Bernstein wing does, and it supports a socialist colonial policy. Now, Sismondi comes back in because Marx quoted Sismondi as saying the proletarians of the ancient world, saying lived at the expense of society, whereas modern society lives at the expense of the proletarians. Okay. Modern society lives at the proletarians. Now, Lenin cites this, right? And he says, aha, but when we're talking about not just capitalist society, but imperialist society, we have to ask the question, who are the proletarians at whose expense society lives off, right? And he really emphasizes that if you're looking at Britain and Western Europe, it's not only British workers and European workers, and Britain was the most sort of acute case, actually is to this day, where the bourgeoisie derived more profit from India than they did from British workers. Okay, and Lenin's pointing this out as the material objective basis for the sort of pro-imperial trend within social democracy. He says he hopes it's a temporary phenomenon. Turns out it's not so temporary, but he has a sort of note of optimism towards the end, which is sort of still an issue for us to this day. Okay, so that's Stuttgart 1907. All of this is run up. Now we come to the theories of imperialism. How did Marxist theorists use Marxist capital to explain imperialism? There were 4 generations. I'm going to go through them quite quickly. Engels started the whole thing, right? He actually puts in a connection between volume 2 and volume 3, which is an addition to Marx, which is sort of, if you like, expressing something that was implicit in Marx. He makes it explicit, which is quite important. But in actual fact, more importantly, from this angle, he starts putting in additions to Marx's text. The difference between 1860s, early 1870s and 1890s. Engels is saying, look at the cartels, look at the monopolies, look at the rise of the banks. And the very last thing he writes, you really need to look at the very last entry into volume 3 of Capital, right? Where Engels says, look at the expansion of imperialism, look at what Cecil Rhodes is doing, right? So things have changed again in the last generation. So this is Engels, not yet a theory of imperialism, but a major disposition to develop Marxist capital to explain imperialism. Hilferdink and Luxemburg used different parts of the 3 volumes. Luxemburg's based on volume 2, Hilferdink's based on volume 3, especially on the organization of capital. That's Hilferdink's thing, really. Kautsky develops, we've read it already, but there's a section in volume 1 where Marx talks about industrial nations and agricultural nations. And Kautsky bases his theory of imperialism on that distinction. Bukharin uses another part of volume 3, which is the question of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and what capital does to coolies, so-called, and Negroes, so-called, in other words, greater exploitation in the colonies. Lenin. What does Lenin do? Right. Well, we've already seen that Lenin had a very good knowledge of capital when he was writing about Russia. That is what I called the early Lenin. But what about when it comes to imperialism? Well, there's 2 major intellectual sources, which are the notebooks and his notebooks on philosophy. But you can't really tie Lenin down in the same way as these other classical writers about imperialism to any one section of Capital. It's very clear he's against Kautsky, and he makes that very clear, right? It's also quite clear that, like Hilferding, he's looking at the organization of capitalist entities, the banks, the trusts, and so on, right? He definitely is looking at that and seeking to develop a theory of it. But it's not a theoretical work. The only other clue I would say is just before the First World War, he publishes something about Marx's economic doctrine. And there, it's the theory of rent, which comes to the fore. So in any case, what you have is an overall reprocessing of Marx with this theoretical generation. Grossman, which we don't have time to look at, but we'll look up next time, is an interim generation. And then we have the generation of the 70s, which reworks the totality once again. And of Marx's departments of production. Then she does an extensive literature review, which I've briefly reviewed, the type of works I've already told you about. And then she looks at the current historical conditions, which gets much more concrete. And this is her basic argument. Capitalism has an inherent tendency to expand as it seeks non-capitalist societies that will buy its commodities. She writes very well, I think, for a European social democrat about slavery in the US South and about the exploitation of Africans in South Africa by the British. And she writes more about different imperialist mechanisms, right?
Yeah, good one.
So she's got quite a detailed evaluation and critique of these departments of production, especially the expanded reproduction, right? This is a summary of it from 2 authors. Her main argument is that you have to rework Marxist schema to include increasing labor productivity, rising organic composition of capital. And once you do that, then it can be seen that there will be a relative overproduction of consumer commodities. In other words, more consumer commodities are produced than the workers have the money to consume. This is her interpretation of what's known as the realization problem. And it's couched in terms of where is the demand in the society to absorb this increase in consumer goods. Now, she's saying that under pure capitalism, it's not possible for all the surplus value to be accumulated. It's just impossible, right? So what you have to have is a way that capitalism has to find a way to find customers outside of capitalist society. Okay. So she's got a very extensive review of Sismondi. She's much more sympathetic to Sismondi than Lenin was. And she basically builds her theory on her positive appreciation of Sismondi. Okay, she mentions Lenin by name, or his pseudonym in actual fact, right? And he's basically saying Lenin's argument was that production will grow faster than consumption. And actually, that's probably true in Russia. But Luxemburg says that's a false argument, and it's the other way around. Consumption goods will grow faster, and that's what generates imperialism, right? So there's lots of contradictions, both in Marx's departments. When she talks about contradictions, she's actually talking about shortcomings and inconsistencies. She's quite critical, right? The problem is with all of this, Luxemburg is piling more and more weight on right? And she's not really, although she mentions profits quite a few times, right? She's really aware of the profit issue. She doesn't position her development from Marx on the question of profitability. She positions it on the question of these departments of production. Okay. So what you end up with some very good comments by Luxemburg about imperialism, which is definitely against all this imperialist expansion. But in my view, it's not theoretically integrated. I should have put this slide earlier. This is a summary of her position. Okay. So there needs to be classes outside the workers and capitalists to consume the commodities that workers don't have the money to buy. And because there aren't classes in capitalist society to do this, then there must be classes outside capitalist society, or societies outside capitalism, rather, to consume. She makes two other arguments. Let me just check on time. I'll go for about another 5 minutes. She makes two other arguments about money and about militarism. She looks at both these issues in terms of departments of production, and the effect of these is to shrink Department 1, which is part of her argument that there's more production of means of consumption than means of production, a tendency towards disproportion, if you like. Okay. Political positions were, the basis of the criticism was quite different, right? So the right of the Socialist Party in Germany, they already supported imperialism, and so they didn't want any Marx whatsoever, right? Now the centre, the Kautsky Centre, Hilford and Kautsky and Bauer, they actually returned to the sort of what I call the legal Marxist argument. And they basically argued, Bauer was the most advanced for a long time, and then Kautsky made a similar argument. No, these departments of production show that capitalism can and will keep on expanding. Okay. Now, what does that mean? And this is the political point, right? The centre and right wings had something in common, right? Which was that imperialism was not a necessary product of the capitalist system, but a particular policy that lobby pressure could change. Okay. So once again, there's no material objective basis of the necessity of revolution. And although Luxemburg can be, critiqued in one sense, politically, she never accepted this. And that was the whole point of her argument, to combat this position, that it's inherent in capitalism that it will be imperialist. Okay. And there was also a left critique, which is actually not so significant. Luxemburg responds to these points. Okay. Yeah, she basically sort of doubles down on the need to rework the second volume of Capital, right? And she claims, and this is where I do definitely disagree with her, that the second volume of Capital is where the totality is first expressed, which is not true. It's expressed in volume 1, and it's also not true that it's where Marx based its whole theory. It was a step in the development of his whole theory, I would say. So we're getting close to the end of my introduction, very long introduction. Bukharin is a very important figure in this discussion. He became really the leading theoretician of the Bolshevik or Communist Party by then, in the mid-1920s. He's quite busy critiquing Trotsky at this time. So what you've got is a sort of, he was known to be on the right of the Bolshevik Party. Theoretically, on these departments, he does take the matter forward. He introduces the algebra correctly for the first time, although they're not particularly, what's the word, user friendly. But if you can follow it, one does accept. I do accept that he's got that right. He's put in algebraic form for the first time the condition of proportionality in expanded reproduction. Okay. But there's really a political agenda, which is, they're arguing against the influence of Luxemburg in the German Communist Party. By this time, Luxemburg was assassinated, but she still had a lot of influence. Her ideas still had a lot of influence, right? And he does, again, the tone is quite harsh, I have to say, but the points themselves, theoretical points, do register. They're valid, right? Which is that Luxemburg argues that capitalism is a system of, well, in Marx's schema, capitalism is presented as a system where it's production for production's sake, right? And he says, well, that's not true. I mean, that's what's true of the legal Marxists, but it's not true of Marx, right? And I mean, he explains that in quite a detailed way. Okay. And the other thing is that he disagrees with the roots of imperialism being under consumption. And here he's very much closer to Lenin's position. He's inheriting now from Lenin's published work. He focuses much more on the question of the export of capital and the generation of surplus profits. Okay. He doesn't go much beyond that, but that point is a crucial one. It is a crucial one. Right. Okay. Luxemburg was misused by Social Democrat John Robinson. In my view, she's also misused by David Harvey. I mean, she was for revolution, not reform, whereas definitely overtly John Robinson and slightly more covertly David Harvey is for reform. Well, he's been quite open in the last couple of years, reform, not revolution. But the point about it is contingency. Imperialism is a policy. It doesn't necessarily flow from the essence of the capitalist mode of production itself. Rosa Luxemburg is very welcome return to influence and interest to this day. She had a surprising position on October 1917, to be honest with you, right? Which is she was against it. She was in prison. I think some of the biographies say she subsequently changed her view, but certainly her initial response was against it. And then you go back to, well, what's the relation between Luxemburg and Lenin in a way, right? And so I do come back to Lenin's defense of the Russian Revolution in October, right? But that's an interesting political endpoint. I will stop my my very long introduction now. You can see how the theory of departments of production gets mixed up very much with the politics, and I hope I wasn't too garbled about that. It's quite a complex story.
Thank you very much. And there was
that was pretty clear. There'll be a spot quiz. Anyway, I apologize for being late. I overslept again. It's the same dream. Somehow being, I assume it's existential, stuck on a subway. But anyway, the New York subway, as I recall. And anyway, are there any questions? Of course there aren't. This won't be on the quiz. I think it's important to note that yes, Higgenbottom goes on a little bit, and we'll discuss a little bit more of this tomorrow in Weekly Marx at 3:00 on Sunday. But I think it's really important to consider he's raising a whole bunch of parallel questions that are actually at the current moment, important in Marx. I mean, you could see that you could generate a question, why Putin is not a Leninist, for example, even though he is, I mean, at its very basis, but he's clearly a, bourgeois, not so much a social democrat, but he's just simply an oligarch like all the rest of his little crowd, and simply relies on capitalism to keep him in place. And so that's kind of where we are in that. I think it's important to note that the argument that is being presented here is one to see everything in its context, to resurrect certain conversations that we've been having about key elements of capital. Also to note, and yes, it is a critique of David Harvey, but I don't, it's a matter of omission, not commission. I think that Harvey has a particular position that he needed to support, and that in his later years, he's, kind of returned to various positions which are important, but I think, as Higgenbottom notes, that they're more social democratic position. So that's the other side of that. And I'll continue this on tomorrow at 7:00. We're having a movie, so obviously we'll go back to our regularly scheduled activity. But this is a very long piece here, of course, and is in two parts, lectures 8 and 9 of the CSSGJ lecture series on Marx's Capital, Volume 2.
Yeah.
So hokey dokey, I will, let's see, stop share and stop the live stream.